Welcome everyone. Thank you again for joining me today for this workshop on social science fiction. I'm Dr. Ash Watson and this is a Social Sciences Week Australia event. I'm very grateful for the support of the Sociological Review, where I'm the fiction editor of their relatively new online fiction series, and a postdoctoral researcher at the Vitalities lab, based in the Centre of Social Research in Health and the Social Policy Research Centre at UNSW Sydney. If you'd like to tweet along with the event, the hashtag is there, SSW2020. My Twitter handle is @AUWTSN if you'd like to tag me in any tweets or with any questions that you have as we go along. With the workshop format today, the way that it's going to run is I'm going to share with you a few of the recent social science fiction projects that I've been involved in over the past couple of years. There'll be some practical exercises towards the end, so hopefully everybody will be very keen to take part in those. Don't worry, you won't be required to share any spontaneous creative writing that you do, but hopefully it is a fruitful starting point for some people who might be interested in contributing to some of the projects that I'm going to talk about today. Because of the Zoom setup and the number of people that have registered for the event, I do have the chat open, but microphones muted. So please feel free to share questions as we go in the chat. I don't want to miss people's questions or kind of risk not responding to them with as much kind of time and detail that I'd like. So following this 1 hour online workshop, I'm going to host a Q&A session on Twitter. So again, you can just use the details on the screen here to do that after the workshop. If you're not on Twitter, please do email me with any questions that you have. I'd love to hear from you and I'd love to talk with you more about social science fiction. So the two key projects that I'm going to talk about today that my experience is based on are these two that are on screen here. So the first, as I mentioned, I am the fiction editor for the Sociological Review. TSR has had an online fiction series running from their website for just over 2 years now. We launched it. So I'm the inaugural editor of this series, and over the past few years we have published 14 short stories of sociological fiction. I'll talk a bit more in detail about those. And the second project was a little bit older. I think it's just over 3 years old now, is Sophia Zine. So this is a zine series also on sociological fiction that publishes microfiction, poetry, all different kinds of visual art that people submit, and has had some amazing submissions over the years. And as I'll circle back to it, and we're about to open the submissions for another volume of the zine soon. So hopefully some people here will be able to share and submit some of their own pieces. The starting point for my work around this topic and with fiction is also a question that a lot of people ask me whenever I talk about fiction, especially at academic conference events. And they say kind of, why should we as sociologists or as social scientists write fiction? Kind of fiction writers exist, literary authors kind of deal with the social world already incredibly well in very, very rich ways, attending to the same kinds of issues and communities and lived experiences that we are also interested in social scientists, and perhaps write fiction in much better ways than we ever could. And I definitely agree with Lewis Coase's brilliant text here, Sociology Through Literature, that fiction does provide a wealth of sociologically relevant material that is really useful as a departure point for the exact same kind of work that we do. As I said, because we are interested in the social world in some very comparable ways to literary writers. Coase's text here is a really interesting one. It takes some of the key themes of sociological theory, kind of class, for instance, and rather than explaining the theme, includes excerpts under the theme's heading from, say, Dickens and Chekhov, I think, talking about class, which is really interesting. A little bit dated since 1972, even though I think the argument very much still stands. If you're looking for more contemporary examples of what social science fiction might be, Here are some great novels, actually some quite a bit older than Coase's work, but some great novels of what I call sociological fiction, although not all of the authors were technically sociologists. The two authors on the right-hand side are both contemporary writers. Many of you, if you're interested in arts-based research, might recognize the name of the top author, Patricia Levy. She's actually the series editor of this series, which is called Social Science Fiction and is published by Brill. And this is a contemporary collection that's been running for a few years of, so it's published by Brill, the academic press, and all of the works included in the series are full-length novels or plays. So American Circumstance and October Birds are two such novels. October Birds might be a really nice one to check out for people in the current moment, as it is written by someone who originally trained as an epidemiologist and then became a sociologist, and it is a novel about a pandemic. Very, very relevant, I think, for the current moment we find ourselves in. You might also recognize the names on the other books on the screen. Everyone except Ursula Le Guin worked professionally as an academic in some kind of social science. Du Bois, you might know, is an incredibly influential American and Black American sociologist. Zora Neale Hurston, very influential in ethnography, and she's an anthropologist. Raymond Williams, a prolific kind of founder of what we now know as cultural studies. Anne Oakley, another prolific sociologist, a feminist scholar, and Frank Parkin, a very well-known criminologist. I include Ursula Le Guin's novel here because I think it's a really great example of ethnographic fiction. So written kind of from the perspective of an ethnographer, is the narrator in the story. Lots of people talk about Le Guin's work as particularly sociological and anthropological, which I think is perhaps a hangover of the fact that her father was an anthropologist at Columbia, and apparently when she was growing up would take her on fieldwork with him. But each of these books, in different but very interesting ways, bring that sociological imagination that is kind of the cornerstone of our contemporary disciplinary sensibility to bear in a fictional world. So if you're looking for some classic examples of novels, these are ones I would definitely recommend, as well as the two contemporary ones on the right, as I mentioned. If you're looking for some shorter and more contemporary fiction pieces, the Sociological Review series, as I said, I'm the editor of, and I've been working on this series since 2018, so 2 years now. The pieces in the Sociological Review are 3,000 word short stories, and they're published with an accompanying 500 word exegesis. So this is a kind of short piece of critical, reflective writing that either kind of, the authors take different approaches in their accompanying pieces, but they either kind of explain the motivations for writing the piece, they flesh out the sociological concepts that they're trying to illustrate in the piece, or they talk about methods, so either of the broader project, which the piece in this series is fictionalizing from the data from, or they reflect on their creative writing process. So lots of different interesting pieces in here covering lots of different interesting topics. Do check it out if you're not familiar with it. And this is a rolling open series. So while we do kind of have themes on the TSR website each month, you can submit a short story that addresses the theme, but it doesn't necessarily have to. We kind of accept submissions on a rolling basis. Here are some examples from the exegesis I was talking about. I didn't want to include any kind of short excerpts from some of the short stories that I've published, or we've published on the site. I think I instead just want to draw your attention to the site as a whole, and hopefully you can spend some time sitting with those works and reading the full short stories. I thought it would be useful though to show you, for example, how the authors talk about their texts in that kind of accompanying explanatory piece that goes with it, the exegesis. So one, for instance, opens by saying this is a story of class, place, temporality, and belonging under post-industrialism. You can see in that very brief opening sentence the kind of core sociological themes that are in the work. The second paragraph there is from a different piece, and you can see kind of references the research that they've drawn on reading while writing their piece that informs the way that the narrative unfolds. The third paragraph there is from the first collaborative piece that we've had submitted, which is wonderful. It's instead of one long short story is three much shorter short stories positioned together, and is a collaborative production between the sociologist Leah and writer Becky. Yeah, a really interesting, nice work. It's kind of a series that is both a form of creative public sociology, so intends to be a way of kind of opening out the products of sociological research and thinking in ways that are perhaps more accessible than our journal articles and other kinds of writing, not just in that they're openly accessible on the website, but also that they try and represent what's important about research through the narrative form. The other project that I mentioned is Sophia Zine. So this is a zine series, as I said, of microfiction, short stories, poetry, visual art. I published 7 editions so far, and an 8th will be forthcoming later this year. Across these editions, rather than the kind of more heavy editorial role that I take up with the Sociological Review, with TSR, for instance, with accepted authors, sometimes I work with authors on a piece through multiple iterations to really kind of strengthen that sociological imagination and the storytelling of the work that they've submitted. With Sophia Zine, I take a slightly different role, and I kind of see my work as more curatorial in its focus. So you find a kind of a more raw voice, a more really kind of nice diversity of voices and perspectives captured in each issue and across all of the issues published so far. And what I do is I kind of, each issue is inspired by the work of a sociologist who's really influenced my own research. And then I kind of think across the invited guest editor's contribution and all of the pieces published in addition to think about what does this work do as fiction and as sociology? What is it that makes fiction sociological, or these creative works sociological? How do they bring those kind of two cultures of thinking together? And that's something that I kind of meditate on in the short editorials that I publish with the pieces. And I just wanted to share some excerpts from those with you today, in a very long-winded introduction to what I think social science fiction is and what the value of it is and perhaps what it can be. So you can see as I talk about in these, I think that fiction can kind of help us not just illustrate the findings from our research, but can help us show the value of sociology. So I really love fiction that as I said, kind of works to do more than that, storying the results and the concrete findings of research. I think that creative writing as a practice is a great addition to the sociological toolkit, because rather than representing our research findings, I think it's a nice process with which we can open up sociological questions. So it's a way of intentionally not sharing conclusions and not sharing those concrete answers that we need to definitively provide when we're writing journal articles in most traditional publications. So I think in doing that and in trying to illuminate the workings of the sociological imagination can help us show the value of sociology. I think that's an incredibly important part of what fiction can do as a project of public sociology. I think fiction can also help us see sociologically. So as well as a really useful product, I see creative writing and fiction writing as an incredibly valuable process for us as sociologists. flex our sociological imaginations, to test how we understand concepts, to open up the ways that we kind of imagine who our research participants are and what they care about and actually what their experience is like, and test those things that we try and find with our more standard research methods. There's a couple of other key points in here that I want to highlight, and I present these in the editorials, I think, as almost mini theses that you can kind of read the pieces in each edition to test and see what you think is happening across the editions. On the top right, I talk about the difference between denoting versus evoking meaning. I think that's a real challenge in writing sociological fiction when we want to switch from kind of telling the audience and the reader what it is to think about the world and prove the way that we think about the world is valuable, and kind of evoke that through the cumulative narrative effects of a story rather than in a kind of parable type way. Underneath that, I think this is from edition 3. That's one of my favorite editions of the zine. It's a thesis that I'm still testing, and I think kind of runs through the rest of what I'll talk about in this workshop today. And it's that my sociological imagination comes to life at the intersection of texture and voice. So that's really the intersection of kind of the lyricism and the language and the perspectives and the voice with which we try and tell a story, and how that intersects with the you know, those felt elements of a story world and those material things that bring a story world to life when you are reading it. I think that in fiction, that is the exact intersection where sociological imagination can come to life. I also wanted to share briefly my own novel, which was published earlier this year in the social fiction series that I mentioned, which is published by Brill. I talk about this book as being an experiment in sociological imagination. So at its core, it's kind of, the story is set over 12 months in Australia and follows a group of young people through their everyday lives. And everything about their lives and what happens to them, that kind of micro level of the story, is fictionalized. And it's set against a backdrop of real events from that year, national and international in scale. And what I'm trying to do with that is test these central Millsian ideas of those narrative relationships between biography and history in order to think about fiction writing as a part of a sociological craft, and to think about the potential as well as the boundaries and limitations of the promise of social science that Mills talks about through writing fiction and trying to enliven that thinking in a fictional story. It's also a kind of a creative attempt to be a work of public sociology. So it tests that famous or perhaps infamous vision of public sociology, depending on your camp, that Michael Burawoy talked about in his 2004 American Sociological Association presidential address. So the novel really kind of works with these two key texts across many themes. Mostly introductory sociology themes. So if you're interested in teaching a book, please do reach out. But centrally, these are the two kinds of visions of the discipline that it wrestles with and tries to fulfill in a creative way. In terms of how I wrote the novel, I've written about this in an article that I published earlier this year in Sociological Research Online, and I've kind of crudely tried to visually represent this. I called it the methods braiding technique. One thing that I had when writing the novel, it was in a sociological research project, drawing on an ethnographic method, kind of desk-based literature analysis and arts-based research, taking the method of fiction writing. And while there's lots of great literature on each of these separate research methods, I struggled with a scaffold that could bring these together in a mixed methods approach, because there wasn't a great amount of work on there on that kind of larger macro methodological level of doing mixed methods research in a way that was kind of considerate of arts-based research. So rather than kind of starting with sociological research and trying to fictionalize that in the form of the novel, or kind of just writing the novel and then kind of doing a sociological analysis of that, as the image tries to represent, I really tried to weave those or braid those together in a process that was an iterative process and happened kind of at the same time while being phase-based. So I kind of did a period of writing and research and kind of in hopefully some kind of ethically attentive ways reflected on how those were coming together, and tried to make sure that in mixing those methods that they were kind of meaningfully mutually influential. When writing this talk, actually what I thought would be interesting though was, rather than just talking about this method on how I wrote a large work of sociological fiction, was thinking about all the ways actually that fiction influenced my sociological development. And in doing that, I came across a list, because I use Goodreads, of all the novels that I read while I wrote my novel. It seems like quite a lot when I represent it here on the screen, but this was over, I think, 3.5 to 4 years. And in kind of promising for this talk to give my list of great sociological novels, as well as those ones that I flagged earlier, I was reflecting on all the ways that, thanks Anne, I was reflecting on all the ways that all of the fiction that I was reading was sociological and was kind of sharpening and focusing my sociological imagination. Kind of circling back to that point that I drew from Koza earlier, that all fiction offers a wealth of sociologically relevant material. Some works in particular were incredibly rich that I want to flag. One was the Neapolitan novels series by Elena Ferrante, so that collection of 4 novels that kind of went as viral as literature can go a few years ago. If you haven't read these, I highly recommend doing so. I think these are some of the most, some of the most sociologically imaginative literature that I've read, especially contemporary works. There's something incredible in the way that she brings together place and culture and class, as well as lots of other things. I'm sure if you've read them that, you know, you could also speak to. But for me, it kind of really sharply brought those things together in a way that I hadn't thought about before, and definitely hadn't felt before. It really brought to life for me a lot of that theory I was reading around culture and class in an incredible way. And kind of based in Italy in an interesting geographic and socio-political context that I hadn't thought about, that kind of helped resolve those conceptual links in different ways. Frank Parkin's The Mind and Body Shop. So Frank Parkin is someone that I flagged actually earlier in my list of those key, more classical novels by well-known social scientists. The Mind and Body Shop is kind of a classic campus novel, although kind of has this very, very amusing dystopian turn in it. So it is based on a university campus and was written a few decades ago, but kind of projected into the future in what Parkin imagined the contemporary university would look like. It's interesting, I think, to think about the kinds of institutional tensions that we are concerned with now, and the ways that we think about them and project them into the future. So Frank's protagonist is a philosopher who, in order to keep the faculty afloat, they have to run a shop, which they call the Mind and Body Shop. A beautiful shout out to the significance still of Cartesian dualism in contemporary philosophy. And Parkin has this brilliant scene where students, in order to get into the lecture theatre, have to pass through turnstiles that they have to put coins into. So they kind of walk around campus and their pockets are way down with coins, and it's so incredibly evocative. And of course, very shortly after, cash is almost completely dead. This is written and imagined in a world where kind of electronic money didn't exist yet. So kind of an interesting in what it gets wrong, but also very interesting in the kind of atmosphere of the contemporary university that it seems to definitely get right. Calvino's piece, The Path to the Spider's Nest, is really interesting, and I include this on this list here actually not because of the novella, but because of the preface before the novella. So this is one of the most innovative prefaces that I've ever read to a book, and he writes it and kind of starts it a couple of times, and kind of starts it and says that I wrote this book and this is what it was about, and this is what I was trying to do, and then kind of stops and says, no, actually, this is what this book is about, this is what I was trying to do, and kind of does that a couple of times in a really amusing way. It kind of unearths that work of making sense of the social world, but also making sense of what what we're doing in the process of writing, and how writing is a sense-making exercise. Yeah, so something really interesting, I think, for checking out if you are interested in the craft of writing as an academic labour. Middlemarch by George Eliot and Unaccustomed Earth by John Paul Lahiri are two very interesting books that actually, until I was reading back up on them for this, I kind of put them on this slide before necessarily connecting what it is that I like about them that they share. I'd thought about them in different ways. So Middlemarch, I think, is an incredible work of literature for sociologists to engage with because of the sheer scope that it takes on in the narrative, the kind of detail of characters' lives, but also the way that it kind of connects a very specific kind of period and place in time with the shifting political undercurrents of an era. Jean Paul Lahiri's work is a novel that's actually comprised of two unconnected sections, but kind of both take similar kinds of characters as their focus. And in a similar way, well, I won't say in a similar way to my novel, I drew inspiration from this book when writing my novel in a kind of, I mean, I could never write it as well, but this is one of the places that I got my inspiration for the structure of my novel. And Lahiri, in a beautiful and kind of cutting, devastating way, connects the fictional lives of these characters who, even though your kind of time with them in the story is only short, because it is kind of a short piece, connects those fictional microcosm to real events that happened, and you're kind of not aware that it's set in a very specific time until a very real event takes place of a kind of a very, very large scale. And it's, yeah, kind of magnificent in the ways that it connects the micro and the macro. And really kind of brings to life that relationship that Mills talks about, that kind of, that it isn't just the focus of the macro and then the micro, and we can think about how they connect, but it's the relation between those things that is what's really interesting, and kind of really the focus on how the narrative peaks. The Bricks That Build the Houses is a contemporary novel by the poet Kay Tempest, which I think is incredible. If you only read the first 12 pages, I think that would almost be enough, though the whole book is fantastic. Kay is from Southeast London and has written a novel set in Southeast London, and I think because of that, captures an incredibly detailed and effective sense of texture of that place in a way that I think is so ethnographic, but kind of a very more than ethnographic. It's brilliantly poetic, and has a real, I talk about it as texture because I think it does have a real felt quality, as I talked about earlier, that I think is important for thinking about how we might craft sociological imagination in fiction and bring it to life through that intersection between texture and voice. So I think all of those novels definitely informed what I learned and what I wrote in my own work. Yes, they are in a Goodreads list. That's where I got them from. So I can definitely share that list. So you can have the full list. But these were some of the ones when really reflecting on writing that book for this workshop that I think are great sociological novels to read, and kind of to read with your sociological hat on. There was one more that really stood out for me, not just on reflecting on it afterwards, I think perhaps like the others did, although I'm sure my copies of all of those books are kind of underlined and their pages are dog-eared on those specific pages that really stood out to me for what they did sociologically. But 100 Years of Solitude has stayed with me since I read it. I think perhaps it came to me at the right time during my PhD, but also it, I mean, if you've read the book, I think perhaps you'll agree, I've never read anything like it. It is so dense and so rich and so surreal. It is a completely surreal narrative, and something incredible that it does. So the excerpt on the left here actually is from an interview from the Paris Review, which I sought out afterwards, after kind of being so completely taken by this novel. And I was so glad to see that in the interview, Marquez talks about this exact phenomenon that I found so striking in the book. And it is that surrealist quality, but the way that when you're reading the novel, nothing about it seems surreal, even though, you know, a kind of a funeral takes place and suddenly from the sky are falling hundreds and thousands of yellow flowers. There's a completely surreal phenomenon even within the realm of the book, but there's kind of nothing unusual or surreal about it in the way that the story is told. The fantastic is kind of almost made mundane in a way that it's incredibly beautiful, but not unusual. And Garcia Marquez talks about this kind of finding this exact tone after writing a number of books. And as it says at the beginning, that's actually a tone that he developed from the way that his grandmother told him stories. These stories that were kind of supernatural and fantastic, but she told them with a completely brick face. And so, yeah, thanks very much. Exactly, magical realism. It's yeah, there's a whole genre of this kind of work. So if it's something that you're interested in, please do check it out. And it's something that definitely really struck me with this book, that exact magical realism quality. In the way that the kinds of details that are included. And in the last paragraph, I'll try and share this interview. It's definitely worth reading in full if you have read the novel or you haven't. And he says there, kind of what I had to do to get the tone right was to believe in these fantastic elements myself and write them with the same expression with which my grandmother told them, with a brick face. So what struck me about this tone and what this book does, considering sociological fiction, is I think that what sociological fiction can do or should strive to do is the exact inverse of this, and it is to make the mundane and the everyday seem completely unnatural and completely surreal. And I think that still the same advice that Garcia Marquez gives for how to achieve that totally applies. And as the bottom paragraph there talks about that it's in the matter of detail, and kind of not just saying that there are elephants flying in the sky, but if you say there are 125 elephants in the sky, people are much more likely to believe you. If you say the house kind of magically fills with butterflies, it's not as believable, but if you kind of give a color to the butterflies, it is much more believable. I think it's that kind of level of detail and that kind of attention to the lyricism of writing, I think that sociological fiction writers can achieve in trying to do the inverse of what Garcia Marquez does. from kind of expressing the fantastic naturally to trying to express the mundane and the everyday unnaturally. Trying to undo that kind of common sense way of thinking, which I think at heart is what the sociological imagination is all about doing. I wanted to share a couple of writing exercises because I think talking about this and reflecting on it and analysing what these great works of literature can do and what they can teach us, I come back to the question of, well, how can we possibly do this? I definitely don't think that these are activities that any of us could perhaps write 100 Years of Solitude equivalent type book with. But I think they are great activities that I have used in a number of workshops with people who have never written fiction before. They're also activities that I have used with students in fiction writing classes and in academic, so non-fiction and scholarly writing classes, that I think are really, really useful. I wanted to share those with you. So they are relatively self-explanatory in title, and not all of them are focused on sociological fiction specifically. So the first two I think are really useful general writing activities that I often do myself when I'm kind of struggling to get into the zone. The hardest part of writing fiction, let alone writing fiction that is kind of manifestly sociological, or writing fiction that is any way of any quality, is sitting at the desk. The second hardest part, I think, is getting words on the page. So the first two activities here help with the getting words on the page thing. The first one is crazily fast writing. So this is an activity that I do over a couple of iterations with a group of people usually. Usually with paper and pen, because it's kind of essentially about getting that felt connection of writing going, kind of remembering the bodily activity that writing is, connecting our hand with the pen. What you do is you set a timer for 30 seconds, 45 seconds, a minute. I think any longer than a minute is dangerous. And the aim is to write as many words as possible before the timer goes. It doesn't need to be sentences, and it doesn't need to be words that make any sense in any order. After a few years of teaching this in writing classes, I had a genius group of students where multiple students in the same one, after I did it kind of 4 or 5 times, and everybody's hands are cramping and people are desperate to get over writing 40 words in 30 seconds. A few students in the group all figured out that they could just write I over and over and over again and easily broke the 100-word mark. So that's a really great one to take into the classroom to just kind of warm up those writing muscles. The second one is non-stop. So this one I like to set a series of timers in the same way to the first crazily fast activity, but with the second one I set the timers for increasing increments. So I might set it for 1 minute first of all, and then have a break, and then 2 minutes, and then 5 minutes, and then 10 minutes. And the point with this activity is to start writing and not stop writing. I also like to do this one with the pen and paper, but I think it would also work typing. And again, it doesn't need to be sentences, and it doesn't need to necessarily make sense or say anything of value on the topic that you're trying to write on. But the point is to get into the zone, and rather than the kind of pen and the hand and the pen, or the hand and the keyboard connection, this one is about trying to stimulate that mind and hand connection in writing, and get into the writing flow, and not kind of sit and wait for inspiration to strike. But it's a nice activity to try and force inspiration to come when you're partway through putting words on the page. Once you've done it a couple of times, it definitely gets a lot easier to kind of set a timer and write non-stop for 5 minutes. And I really mean non-stop there. So no pauses, no breaks to think about what sentence that you'll write next. If I get stuck, I have no idea what to write next, but I need to keep writing, and there's a bird outside the window, and I just kind of keep going. And the point is not to get anything legible down on the page, but to just not stop until the buzzer goes. And the more that you do it, the easier it is to then kind of sit down for 5 minutes and 10 minutes and spew out a whole heap of things on a set topic that you are trying to write on. Whether that's kind of a fictional scenario that you're hitting a roadblock with, or kind of just a piece of writing that you're procrastinating on or finding difficult to figure out where to go with next. The third activity, Think With, is one actually that I'd love people to get involved in now. So if you have it handy, I'll get you to please grab a piece of paper and a pen. If you don't have that on hand, feel free to open a blank Word document and I'll talk you through the activity. If you're listening to this while making dinner or answering emails or thinking, I am definitely not going to write any fiction and she'll have no idea whether I do it or not, I would encourage you, especially if you've never written fiction before or at least not read it since you were a teenager, stuck in an English high school classroom, to end or maybe start your day, depending on where you're joining us from, with trying something new. So the Think With activity is something that I do when I am perhaps struggling with a sociological concept and I want to kind of test my understanding of that concept and how well I can apply it to a given scenario or perhaps to a set of data that I have. Or something that I'm doing just when I'm kind of interested in doing some creative writing, especially when I'm trying to write intentionally sociological fiction. And the first thing that I do, so it requires 3 things to plan down. The first thing is a setting. So take a moment to pick any setting of your choice. This might be quite general, like a park, a home, a bus stop, in a car, in a bathroom, in a grocery store. Or it could be more specific. So it might be one of your field sites, maybe the home of one of your participants. I'll give you a minute to think of a setting that we're going to write about. The second thing that you'll need is 2 actors. I won't call these characters because they don't necessarily need to be human, although if at least one of these 2 actors is human, you might find it slightly easier to start your writing with. So this could be yourself and someone else, a stranger, someone you know, a fictional creation from a series of your participants. It might be 2 people who are not, neither one of them is you. It might be a person and a pet. It might be a person and a piece of technology. It could be any 2 combinations of actors who have some kind of, however fleeting or long-standing relationship. As I said, it could be kind of yourself and a stranger that you might pass in a public place. Might be 2 people who know each other very well. And the last thing that you need, which might be slightly harder to come up with on the spot, is a concept or an issue. So this might be something that you can draw from whatever kind of research or study or teaching that you're doing at the moment, or maybe a topic from one of the other great social science week events that you've been to this week so far. It might be something, a really broad kind of cornerstone sociological topic like race or gender. It might be something much more specific. I'll give you a moment to come up with at least one topic or issue. Sometimes it can be useful if you've got a few things on hand to come up with a very short list of some that you might think with. And what we're going to do with these three things, so we have our setting, we have our two actors, and we have our concept or our issue that we're going to think with in this exercise, is we're now going to try and write some sociological fiction based on those things. Now, importantly for this very first draft type stage is to please know that the first draft of everything, as the eternal advice is absolute shit most of the time. So please do not kind of be held back by the idea that when writing something in the first iteration or the 100th iteration that you're trying to kind of write something perfect, something that is meaningfully, identifiably sociological, that's kind of this brilliant concept distilled into a short scenario. I want you to not think about the product that you're trying to make here, but kind of sit with the process and lean into the process of creative writing, and think about it as something that can stimulate our sociological imagination as an exercise. It won't necessarily produce great writing at the end, but is not really the point at this point. So what I'd like to do now is I'm going to set a timer for just a couple of minutes, maybe 3 minutes altogether. And I'd like you thinking of those three things, your setting, your two actors, your concept or your idea, is to just start to write. Start perhaps by writing the setting, set the scene. What can you see? What can you hear? What can you touch? What are the colors there? Introduce the characters, the actors. Who are they? Where have they come from? What are they doing in this place? And when you're bringing those things to life, think with your concept. Don't necessarily try and illustrate it, but have it there on hand, kind of within reach in your mind, while you start to illustrate these things. I'm going to start the timer now, and I'll give you 3 minutes just to start that writing. As per the advice with a non-stop one, if you don't know where to start, just start with that basic details. Where are they? Who are they? And try to not stop until I say so. just under a minute and a half left. Just trying to start some fiction writing, trying to not stop. Okay, we'll stop there. Thanks everyone who gave that a go. So I will kind of summarize this in a follow-up anyway, but just to reiterate, the think with process is starting with setting a place. 2 actors, may or not be human, but at least one is usually easier. A concept or an issue, something that you're working with in your kind of social science research or teaching or learning, and setting aside a given period of time to creatively write and try and draw those things together. And we're really kind of keeping in mind that it's not about the final product here. It is really sitting with the creative process as a way of stimulating our sociological imaginations and flexing our understanding of concepts that we are trying to think with while we're writing. The 4th exercise here, also relatively self-explanatory, is rewrite. Just like the set period there of starting writing, starting from scratch, taking things to try and write and think with, is setting given periods to do that rewriting work. So much of the quality in terms of kind of stylistic literary quality and the strength of a sociological imagination as we can kind of bring it to life in a fictional story is made in the rewriting and the editing process. So it's in that process of rewriting that we can turn our attention to the product that we're trying to bring together. And I think that's where we can really work on drawing those things out once we've kind of come through that more creative early phases of kind of thinking with and non-stop writing and crazily fast writing, which are all about just kind of stimulating those writing connections, those very bodily writing connections, and getting some words down on the page. So hopefully somewhere to go from here. With the writing that you've just started or with any writing that you continue to do in the future. I'll flag again the Sociological Review short story series. So as it says here, what we're really seeking for this is high quality fiction that is considered reflective and attuned to the Sociological Review's sensitivities. So I'm looking for work as an editor here that's sociological in style, in scope and sensibility. So not necessarily work that kind of nicely and neatly fictionalizes research that you've done and kind of strong findings that you have, but is work that really imaginatively extends that craft of sociological imagination into fiction. You can find out the full submission details at the link that's there. Again, I'll share this afterwards. So what I'm looking for is stories, short stories that are around 3,000 words. You can give or take a little bit depending, and 500 word exegesis, and you submit both of those at the same time. That's important. And as I said, all the guidelines are on the site, and you can read all of the 14 excellent pieces that we've been able to publish so far there as well. Also, so Sophia Zine, as I said, I'm very excited to have another issue coming out later this year. This will open for submissions probably in a week, depending on how quickly I pull everything together. So this is a space for shorter stories and microfiction. So short stories of up to 1,200 words, or drabbles, which are microfiction pieces of exactly 100 words. I think the drabble in particular is a great piece to do that exercise for that we just did together. Trying to bring those things together, a very kind of succinct place, couple of key actors, and perhaps just one sociological idea that you're bringing to that, and trying to do the hard work of representing that in exactly 100 words. I'm absolutely stoked to have as a guest editor for this issue Ruha Benjamin, who's written an incredible piece on racial fictions, which is cited over on the left-hand side here. This is a piece that includes quite a lot of fiction throughout our article and weaves it throughout the argument. And I strongly recommend checking it out. You can access it actually through Ruha's website as well as through the journal there. And this is a piece for me that really illustrates the power of this approach and the necessity of taking creativity and critical exercises of imagining seriously, and the importance of doing so for the discipline and the value of what we can do. So as she argues here, doing this kind of work in making fictions like this, it's not about convincing others of what is, kind of trying to record those true, realistic records of the field or of the people's experiences that we've kind of gathered from doing interviews, for example. But the point is to expand our visions of what is possible. So she says that in this sense, fictions are not falsehoods, but are refashionings through which analysts experiment with different scenarios, trajectories, and reversals. This is exactly also how I see the power of sociological fiction. I'm so much less interested in the truth/fiction divide than in kind of discussions around content and form, and on form, what kind of writing creatively and writing narratives. How much of them are true and not is almost beside the point. What's really important is what they can do and what kinds of worlds they can help us see. So please keep your eyes peeled for all of those updates. If you'd like to stay in the loop for these things, please do subscribe to my Substack. This is just a newsletter where I bring all of my sociological fiction work together. As I said, I'll share the things that I've talked about today on that and via email. I'd love you to join me for a Q&A session on Twitter following this. You can tag me. My Twitter handle is @AWTSN. Please use the hashtag Social Sciences Week 2020. I'll also catch all of the tweets that you share there. As I said also at the start, if you're not on Twitter, no worries. I don't feel left out at all. Please feel free to email me. You can find my email address in all of these places. It's also ashley.watson@unsw.edu.au. Thank you so much for joining me. Enjoy the rest of your evening or your morning, wherever you're coming here from today. Hopefully I will see your submissions in these places soon. Thank you so much. Bye.